It's my very great pleasure and honor on behalf of Heritage and our distinguished president, Senator Jim DeMint, to welcome you this morning and to be able to introduce this, the fourth lecture by Speaker Newt Gingrich in this series. Newt and I were reminiscing not too long ago about our first encounters. It was, I believe, 1977, before you were first elected, having tried a couple times, but anyway, that's trial and error and all is how the system works. We invited this very bright history professor from Georgia to come up to Heritage and share a brown bag lunch when we were over at Stanton Square in 3 townhouses in a row. And this professor started saying things like he could envision days in the future when people would actually work from home with their computers and not have to go into an office, and they would then connect to a mainframe and all that. Well, this was before the internet and a few things like that, but the basic notion that somebody was actually trying to run for Congress who could look at the future and try to figure out where we were going and how we might get there better and more effectively really grabbed all of us inside Heritage, who always thought of ourselves as being thinkers as well and looking toward the future. So we've had a very good and close relationship with Newt ever since. When he was leading the charge and before he became Speaker, we were honored indeed that one of his first public lectures after he was elected Speaker was to a Heritage Foundation President's Club. And during the course of his speakership, we worked with him on a number of public policy issues. Occasionally we disagreed. When we did, we think we did so in a very civil and restrained way, and pointed out why we were obviously right and he was occasionally wrong. But most of the time, it was a very close and collaborative relationship. And that continued and has continued up to this day. And it's really a great pleasure that he has been able to be with us and to present this series of half a dozen lectures during this month, talking to us about Trump and what Trump means for the country and how to interpret Trump and Trumpism. So, Mr. Speaker, welcome back again today. We're honored and delighted you're here, and we will have 4 more during the course of this month. And I thank all of you for being here, and over to you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you, and I also want to thank the people who have been consistently watching. We've had over 1,000 people on Facebook Live consistently. We've had over 100,000 people who watched the first speech that we gave here back in December. So there's clearly an interest in trying to understand Trump. And today I'm going to talk about the Trump way, ahead of schedule and under budget, because I think this is one of the greatest challenges as we approach the inauguration, to get the Republicans in Congress, the Republicans in the cabinet, the president himself to understand the gap between the Trump approach, which is ahead of schedule and under budget, and the Washington approach, which is behind schedule and over budget. And to really, one of the key decision points will be over the next 6 months or a year. Are they prepared to impose their will enough to actually break through the system and have a Trump-style federal government, which would be very, very different. I want to thank my very, very good friend, Ed Fulner, who has been a colleague in arms now for a very long time. Also, Senator Jim DeMint, who has been doing a great job here at Heritage. I want to thank the Heritage Foundation. Heritage was the decisive intellectual center in the Reagan transition and in all the bold policy changes. Over 2,200 recommendations in its 1,093-page report, Mandate for Leadership. And as Ed pointed out, a year later they came back and issued a report card. And as good as it was, based on their criteria, the Reagan administration got a 62. So I think the highest score of any administration in modern times, but it's still a 6. Heritage is a very tough place. I think as Speaker, I ranged some weeks between 100 and 0. I would go up and down depending on which issue we were on. But in that transition, they played a big role. And once again this year, Heritage is playing a major role in the transition for the Trump administration. These speeches, I think, are in the tradition of Heritage's vision statement, which is, quote, "to build an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish." And I think that's pretty close to making America great again. This is the fourth speech trying to outline the principles of Trump and Trumpism. The first was December 13th at Heritage on the principles of Trump and Trumpism. The second was December 14th at the National Defense University. The third was this last Tuesday. There will be 4 more speeches in January explaining the phenomenon and applying it. All of them will be posted both at Heritage and at Gingrich Productions. And in addition, there's a very small electronic book called Electing Trump that's essentially my notes in my columns and newsletters over the last 2 years. The key idea for all of this, and the reason I'm spending so much time on it, is that I believe this is a watershed, or it certainly could be a watershed. I don't think we know yet whether or not we can live out the potential, because it's clear that the election was a watershed. And just as in 1980, the Reagan election was a watershed, and just as in 1994, the contract with America was a watershed. But in those other 2 cases, the establishment fought back, and the watershed gradually receded, because we didn't really break through and fundamentally, profoundly change the Rooseveltian system. And so the question now is, after 84 years, is this the moment where you have enough energy, enough momentum? The fact that Republicans control 25 states, where they have the governor, the House, and the Senate. The fact that we have over 4,100 state legislators, more than any time in the history of the Republican Party. The fact that you have a remarkably charismatic and articulate leader in Donald Trump. All of these things create the possibility that this will truly be, in the most profound sense, a watershed. I think it is a watershed, and I think that parts of it are just Trump himself. I think somebody else who sort of was like Trump but wasn't Trump would be totally different. This is part of why I talk both about Trump and Trumpism. I think there are aspects of his entire life that are so different that the news media has been absolutely unable to think about or learn from or grasp. And that's true, frankly, for the think tanks, and it's true for the staffs. It's going to be an amazing couple years watching this intersection between a very powerful personality and a system which hasn't seen anything like this in modern times. You have to think of Trump as 1/3 Andrew Jackson for disruption, 1/3 Theodore Roosevelt for pure energy, and 1/3 P.T. Barnum for full-time selling. And when you put those 3 together, you begin to have a sense of the impact of Trump as a person. Part of it is that Trump is Queens and not Manhattan. And this, I think, is something people tend to forget. He grew up in a very, very different environment than the Upper East Side of Manhattan. Part of it is that he spent 5 years in military prep school, something which almost no news media has looked into, but which had 8th grade through high school. You know, he's in a military uniform. He ends up as the leader of the cadets. He's already entrepreneurial. There's a story about him negotiating to make sure that the cadets get to lead a parade, because they were going to be in second place. And he said, "Not when I'm in charge." And they made a deal, and they ended up leading the parade. I mean, there are a lot of aspects of his style which are actually surprisingly parallel to military behavior. It's important to recognize that he is an entrepreneur, not an intellectual. That he actually wants to get things done more than he wants abstract knowledge. It was very funny. There was a moment where, in the campaign, some reporter said, "Well, don't you need to know about ISIS?" And he said, "Well, when I need to know about ISIS, I'll know about ISIS. But this week I'm a candidate. I don't need to know that." And all of the Washington reporters, of course, were aghast, because the Washington idea of sophistication is knowing a great deal about something while not knowing anything in depth. And so, you know, if you could name the capitals of 42 countries, you would clearly be a sophisticated person. And if you could name the appropriate wine to drink in each of the 42 countries, you would be a superstar. Now, if you actually know anything about the countries, that'd be all right, but it's not important. Well, Trump's just the opposite. He needs to know what he needs to know in order to be successful. And so he's constantly shifting what he needs to know, because what he needs to know changes depending on what success is all about. I think it's also important to understand that he was a builder, not a financier. And this is one of the things I think people really misunderstood. Financiers sit in offices and play games in which they try to figure out, in theory, will they end up with more than they started with. And good financiers end up with more, bad financiers end up with less. But it's all second-order abstraction. There are three characteristics about building a building that nobody in the city's come to grips with. The first is, if you build a building, it actually has to stand. This isn't like NASA, which has now had 14 studies on how to get to Mars, none of which have gotten us 1 inch closer to Mars. You can actually stack all the papers up and be closer to Mars. Well, that doesn't work if you're actually constructing things. And in fact, if you have contracts with banks and you have loans and you have people contracted to move in, you actually have to build the building on time, and it has to stand up. Second, you have to know what your customers will pay for. And if you go to Trump Tower, they redid the entrance to Trump Tower because they had a huge new client who didn't like the entrance and offered a long enough lease at a high enough amount of money. They redid the whole entrance because it was a practical business decision. So you not only have to come in on time with a real building which works, but you have to build a building your customers will pay for. Otherwise, you have a big building that goes broke. Third, if you're really going to be in the building business, you'd better get used to talking to people who build things. And a lot of the Trump appeal was that he has a natural style that is a Queens contractor, not a Wall Street financier. He knows how to talk to blue-collar workers. Why? Because he spent his whole career talking to blue-collar workers. And so you have this very different phenomenon than anything that Washington is ready for. It also means you focus on the micro. You don't talk about, is the plumbing okay in general? You go look at the plumbing and you find out if this particular piece of plumbing isn't working right, you got to fix it. You want to know the micro aspects of your workers. A story told about one couple who worked for him who had a baby, and the next morning there was a car seat from Donald J. Trump. You want to know what they need, what their worries are, what their concerns are, because that maximizes the work they're going to do for you. So he has an understanding. This is why he's been very careful in saying over and over again, you cannot repeal Obamacare in a way that scares 20 or 30 million people. Because he knows those people. Those are the folks who worked with him. He also has it's also based on fact rather than theory. You know, there's a great line. I'm going to recommend two books which I suspect almost no one in the media has read. Both of them are available. One was a long-term New York Times bestseller called The Art of the Deal, which I'm going to briefly read to you from. The other is, I think, more fascinating psychologically, The Art of the Comeback. Now, at the beginning of The Art of the Comeback, he quotes, and I'm going to put on my glasses for a second, he has a great quote from Frank Lloyd Wright, which will explain part of what this is all about. Wright says, the physician can bury his mistakes, but the architect can only advise his client to plant vines. Because, you know, at the end, if there's going to be a Trump Tower and he builds it, it's standing there. So if it's going to be a really good place, he's got to make sure as the builder, it's going to be a really good place. And that's why you're going to see a very different attitude. And I've watched him, and I'll come back to this, but I've watched him with his creating a cabinet, and it's very, very impressive to see how he does it. And involves enormous attention to detail, which I'll come back to. So it also means pragmatism rather than ideology. And by that, remember, pragmatism, William James said, was the only unique American contribution to philosophy. And the essence of pragmatism is you go out and you find the facts, and then you develop a theoretical explanation of the facts. You don't develop a theory and then coerce the facts to fit the theory. Something which Robert Conquest in his great work on Soviet totalitarianism said is doomed to fail. He said no matter how idealistic you are, if you start with a theory and try to coerce humans to fit the theory, you're going to have a terrible outcome. And so Trump is a person who gets up every day and he wants to know what's really going on. That's why I thought his one comment when he accepted a phone call from the president of Taiwan, and they said, well, theoretically, Taiwan doesn't exist. And he said, well, we've sold them billions of dollars of weapons. So if they exist enough to get billions of dollars of weapons, don't they exist enough for a phone call? Now, if you think about it, it's a remarkably, let's cut out all the political correctness, let's cut out all the abstract, establishment theories. Tell me about the real world. So, in a way, I would argue that he's a reversion to Tocqueville, to Lincoln, and to Washington. If you go back and look at the original American system, it was an extraordinarily fact-based system. Now, it's inherently conservative because facts, in fact, lead you to conservative conclusions. And, but the conservatism grew out of the experience of reality. It's Washington, having served in the field for 8 years as a commanding general, who understands the importance of national defense, not as a theory, but because he'd lived it. And he understood that without adequate national defense, the British would have won the war. It's Lincoln who is applying the law within a very complicated environment and who understands something which we will presently find Lincoln is the best single guide to fighting domestic subversion, because that's what he had to do. He locked up half the Maryland legislature. And people said, well, you're not allowed to do that. He said, we're in the middle of a civil war. Of course I'm allowed to do it. And anyway, sue me. By the time you get done with the courts, the war will be over. But he was trying to construct at a practical level, what do we have to do to survive? As opposed to the great memoir he would have written had we lost. I was noble, but we failed, was not one of of Lincoln's theories. And in that sense, I think Trump and Lincoln could have had a long chat. I also think if you think about working with blue-collar workers, you understand, when Trump said the other day, I have 3 words to describe my goals: jobs, jobs, jobs. That's because the people he worked with to build all these buildings and to build the golf courses and to run the golf courses and to run the hotels, they understand jobs are the most powerful social program you can have, because jobs give you dignity, they give you income, and they give you hope for a better future. And they put you into a network of healthy people who are also working at jobs. And so a lot of that grows straight out of his personal experience, because he knows that his workers and their families really valued jobs, and they really valued take-home pay, and they really valued a better opportunity. So what you have is a president-elect who is entrepreneurial rather than either corporate or bureaucratic. This is part of why he can tweet. He knows what he thinks. He doesn't have to go to the staff and say, would 5 of you sit down and think for a long period and come back and tell me whether or not I actually think this? I talked to a European politician the other day who said to me his staff wouldn't allow him to have a Twitter, to be able to tweet. And I said, in the world of Donald J. Trump, that would mean they wouldn't be staff anymore. So here's the model. And I almost tried to put this up and decided it was too hard. So you have to use your imagination. Think of a table. And imagine the table has 4 legs. One leg is anti-left. One leg is anti-political correctness. One leg is anti-stupidity. And one leg is passionately pro-American. Now, those are the boundaries of the table. My argument in part is, and it took me months to come up with this, so if you don't like it, don't tell me. I won't be able to take the pain. But Callista, and I'm thrilled that Callista could join us today. Callista and I talked about this a lot all through the summer and early fall. The reason you can't predict Trump on a tactical basis is he has permission in his own mind to go anywhere on the table spontaneously. And I'm going to deal with this in greater length because it's something that this city completely misunderstands. Trump is about pure speed. And so if Meryl Streep hits him at 6:37 in the morning, he hits Meryl Streep. And people go, that's very undignified. And he says, yeah, so what? And they say, presidents don't do that. And he says something. I learned this as a freshman in Congress. I've been a college teacher. And I'd read books about Congress. And so I'm walking up the back of the Rayburn building one day. I'm on the outside. It's a sunny day. I still remember it vividly. And I'm thinking, what is it that political scientists told us about congressmen do certain things? And I suddenly realized, political scientists interview congressmen, and then they write up what they think the congressman told them. But I was a congressman. So if I did something different, someday a political scientist would interview me, and they'd write a book about what congressmen do, and it would be what I was doing. Because I was a real congressman. I wasn't a student congressman. And I never again worried about what you did. I just did what I thought worked. Well, that's Trump. You know, Trump doesn't get up in the morning and go, oh gosh, I wonder how somebody else would do this. He gets up and thinks, well, how would Donald J. Trump do it? And it's very different. Now, the boundaries are actually stunningly conservative, but you don't think of them automatically as conservative. He is potentially the most effective anti-left leader in modern times. Because if you combine anti-political correctness with anti-left, with anti-stupidity, with a pro-American nationalism, you have just ruined the lives. I mean, you've eliminated all the safe spaces at Harvard. I mean, at Harvard, there will be people hiding in bomb shelters. I saw some Canadian leaders the other day, and I thanked them for not having closed the border yet. Because I think it's important to have a place that leftists can go to where they can feel secure and comfortable in the winter, preferably up around Moose Jaw. Anyway, so think of this. If you build this table into your head as a way of analyzing and explaining, what you understand all of a sudden is you don't know where he's going to be on the table. When he gets up in the morning, and I'm going to go through why this is true and how it relates back to his military school days, but when he gets up in the morning, he intuits either an opportunity or a problem and moves to it, but he pretty consistently stays inside the table. He's almost never pro-left. He's almost never pro-political correctness. He's certainly never pro-stupidity. And he's always pro-American. And you can imagine how he'd never get tenure at any major school. So in a sense, what he focuses on within this predictability about values and direction is the idea that big dreams can be aggressively implemented. And that's what he's done all his life. If you read, again, in The Art of the Deal, which was a big New York Times bestseller for a year, wrote it in the 1980s. He was on his way up. He was a brilliant young guy. When he comes over from Queens and builds his first building, it's actually the Hyatt building, which you can see right next to Grand Central Station. He totally redesigns the hotel because he wants it to be a landmark. He also illustrates one of the hallmarks of his career as a negotiator. He convinces Hyatt to not build any other Hyatt hotel in New York. I think a contract they still have. And so he has virtually a monopoly. But you go look at the building now, again, it's dwarfed by the Trump Towers, which is later when he has lots more money. And when he's learned a lot more, and he's gotten to be a lot smarter guy. All that's in here, and it's very positive. But the principle is, this is a guy who wants to dream big. You know, he gets up in the morning, he doesn't want to spend his life on small dreams. And so, you know, he doesn't say, make Donald Trump great again, which is very interesting, and nobody's really picked up on this. He says, make America great again, which becomes the entire theme. The hats say, make America great again. A traditional politician would have been about them. He understood if it was about America, and he's the guy making America great, that makes him bigger than any traditional politician. Because you can't build your ego big enough. Well, Obama came close, but normally you can't build your ego big enough to subsume an entire country. De Gaulle did, but that's because his name was De Gaulle. I mean, so, you know, he was in a position where he wants big dreams. So he says, I think I'll run for office. How does presidency sound? Well, it's the right size dream. I mean, if you're already worth somewhere between 4 and 10 billion, depending on how you keep score, you know, bottom is probably 4, top's probably 10, but enough that, you know, you can run for president off the interest. You never touch capital. Why not run for president? You know, he's a big enough name that by 1988, Oprah Winfrey asked him, is he going to run for president? In 1988. He looks at it seriously in the 1990s. I mean, so it's not like it happened on a Tuesday afternoon. This is a guy who'd been thinking about I'm a national leader. Why shouldn't I go lead the nation? For a very long time. And when he had best-selling books, and then he had the #1 TV show, and he's on TV for 13 straight years, and nobody in the elites even knows it. You know, the closest the elites came was the phrase, "you're fired," which is what just happened to him. I think Jim Acosta just learned what it was like to be on The Apprentice. You know, so it's a framework. So the big dreams pull him forward, and he's always trying to move the table forward within the framework of those 4 core principles. And so he brings enormous energy to trying to do that. And it's a process of constant movement. He also understands a pragmatic notion that you reinforce success and you starve failure. So if you watch during the campaign, the people who seemed to be working out and being correct became bigger and bigger and bigger. The people who didn't seem to be working out became smaller and smaller. And he was constantly evolving because he'd never run before. So he's inventing an entire campaign style, and nobody's really studied this seriously. The Trump campaign system annihilated its opponents. I mean, nobody looks at that and really says, what did he do? You know, and it goes back to, those of you who've heard me before, I always reference Nassim Taleb's brief essay, which all of you can find on Google, Intellectual Yet Idiot, in which Taleb explains that we have more and more people who can write essays and answer questions on tests but don't know anything. And so they get better and better grades because they go to schools where they have professors who can write essays and answer questions. And then they get good jobs in places like the New York Times or the Supreme Court or the bureaucracy because they can write questions but they don't know anything. Well, that's also our consulting class. And so Trump came along, and instead of hiring the usual suspects, remember, Jeb Bush spends about $105 million and gets 1 delegate. And it was fascinating to me to show you how unwilling to learn the news media was. Reporters would come up to me like in May and June, I guess it was May, June, and July, and say, "Do you realize Hillary Clinton last month spent $22 million and Donald Trump spent $300,000 on advertising?" And I say, "Yes." "And how much did Jeb spend?" And they'd stare at you and they go, "Oh yeah, I guess that's right." But they wouldn't change what they wrote. You know, Trump is going to be drowned. Well, Trump wasn't going to be drowned. Trump had invented a new system. It was a system that started with the idea, if you get up early in the morning and you Twitter at, Morning Joe will pick it up. Then you call into Fox and Friends, chat with them for a while. Then you send something out as a tweet that dominates the news for 5 hours. Then you go and do something at lunch. Then in the evening you go on Hannity for an hour. Or anybody else who wants you, because the truth is you're getting such huge ratings that virtually anybody would take Trump. And then the other person was out and did 9 fundraisers to raise the money to buy ads. And you're saying, now why are they buying the ads? Well, so they can reach people. Oh, and how would they reach people? Well, they would use Twitter, Facebook, and television. Really? What if I just skip the fundraising part and buy the ads part, and I just do Twitter, Facebook, and television? Does that count? And nobody got this. I mean, it was amazing to watch the difference. He's now up to about, I think the mythical number is 45 million people. So he's vastly bigger than any network. He's vastly bigger than all the major newspapers combined. And he knows it. I mean, it's not like these are random things and he's a stupid guy and isn't he lucky? This isn't the great novel about college, Oh Lucky Jim. This is a guy who in a knowing way invented a machine which is free, which is a hallmark of the Trump model. They love Facebook and they love Twitter because they're free. So they say, let's go have a rally in Poughkeepsie. I know, we will email on and Facebook and Twitter on Tuesday and tell the press, and we'll show up on Thursday, and there will be 23,000 people. Do you know how much phone banking it takes for a normal candidate to get 2,300 people? And he was doing this routinely. Towards the end, he's doing 5 rallies a day for free. I mean, they have to pay for the rally site. But other than paying for the rally site, the rest of it was just, and here's the secondary part that they came to understand. You had 20,000 people in a room, all of them with smartphones. They're all taking your picture. They then send it to all of their friends on Instagram and on Facebook and you name it. So let's say the average person has 40 friends. That's 800,000 views. not counting any of the friends sending it on. So he is twice the size of MSNBC at every rally, and about 60% bigger than CNN. It's just an astonishing, but he was inventing all this. Now, because of this background, he has a model that in order to reinforce success and starve failure, you have to have very fast feedback. And they had a data system that allowed them every night to have more information than any of the pollsters. It also is a fact that you have to figure out exactly what you're trying to do, and you have to pay attention to what you're doing. What are you measuring? The model in the military is called an OODA loop, OODA loop. It's very important. Trump either learned this in his military academy or just picked it up over the years. But it's a very sophisticated model which changed a great deal of the American military, and which came from studying the F-86 and the MiG-15. If I can observe what's going on, orient myself to what it means, make a decision about what I should do, and act faster than you, and then pivot back to observing, I will inevitably build up a momentum that you can't cope with. And so that's the whole basis of the modern American military system, is that we try to, on a theater-wide level, have so much information in real time that our opponent doesn't know where we are, we know where they are. We know what they're trying to do, they don't know what we're trying to do. That's the theory of this whole thing. Well, Trump was doing that. He's still doing it. He thinks constantly about what's going on in the real world, and he does part of it just by watching television more than any senior politician I've ever seen. I mean, it is weird the number of times I've done something on TV and he's either called me or emailed me or something and said, that was good. Like within minutes. You're going, okay. Sometimes he didn't say that because he didn't agree with me. But the point is, this is a guy who's gathering data all day. He talks to people all day long. This is why this notion of what's the hierarchy in the White House? Donald J. Trump. Yeah, but what's the hierarchy? It's Donald J. Trump. There are people around him, but it's like circles coming out. I mean, so Reince Priebus is really important as chief of staff. You know, Steve Bannon is really important as a strategic planner. Kellyanne Conway is really important as a communicator. Jared Kushner is really important as a guy who can reach across all of this, and so is Ivanka. Mike Pence is going to be very important because he really fits what Trump was looking for. He's a very solid, very steady guy with huge connectivity on the Hill, and he can get a lot done. No one of them, there's no way to build an organized hierarchy out of that. Because Trump doesn't just go to them. He picks up the phone and goes to anybody he wants to. And he's very good at it and has been his whole life. So you have this model building of somebody who learns very fast, makes decisions very fast. And then he also understands, whether intuitively or because he studied it, the essence of maneuver warfare. Maneuver warfare is a very simple but very hard to do thing. It says the following: you avoid your opponent's strength. You try to find their weakness. When a breakthrough occurs, you exploit it as rapidly and as aggressively as you can. Well, if you watched him in the early days as he was learning how to be a candidate and he was learning how to debate, you can almost see him doing all this instinctively. He's watching each of his opponents. He's measuring them. I mean, in the early days, he's very quiet most of the time. And he's watching all the guys on the stage. And he's watching the media. And he's thinking through, how do I avoid the thing you're really good at? What's your weakness? How do I go after it? Now, he combines that with something that took me months to figure out. He is a genius at branding. And this is very important as we think about the future of the movement. Branding is different than attacking. Branding is establishing an identity. I mean, one of the great things the left did that enabled them to survive being utterly incompetent is they branded Republicans and conservatives as racists. So it didn't matter who you were, it didn't matter what you believed, you carried this brand. And if you were Latino or African American or Asian American or Native American, and I said, let me introduce you to a Republican, the first thing you knew was, oh yeah, a racist. And it wasn't one attack or 5 attacks, it was an overwhelming, which they've tried recently with the Attorney General designate Sessions. It is an automatic, let me tell you how bad these folks are, and it's a branding device. not an attack device. Because if I can brand you so you're totally unacceptable, then I don't have to worry about attacking you. You're already out of the game. People won't pay attention. So go back and look at what Trump did during the primaries. The first really big success, frankly, is taking out Jeb Bush. And he takes him out because he knows Jeb has huge amounts of money. He has all of his father and brother's network. He has the natural bias of the elite media. And how does he take him out? He says, you know, I don't know why you're low energy. Doesn't it bother you that Jeb's so low energy? Now notice the way he's doing it. It becomes and this is what the left does to us on race. It becomes a fact by repetition. You don't. It's not an attack. He's not attacking Jeb. He's just saying, you know, I almost feel sorry for him. You know, watching him drag in here tonight. I mean, you know, they got to a point where they got inside Jeb's head, and he's running around, literally running in New Hampshire, so people can see he's not low energy. Think about that. You know, how did Hillary Clinton become Crooked Hillary? Well, she became Crooked Hillary by her own behavior. But how did she get to be known as Crooked Hillary? Because Trump figured out one afternoon, I'm just going to start calling her Crooked Hillary. Sean Hannity and I had this really long talk with him at one point about becoming presidential. And, I mean, he was very patient. It lasted like 40 minutes. He's very patient. And he says, guys, I can't do that right now. I still have 5 or 6 candidates I've got to knock out. And if I become presidential, I won't become the nominee. But just let me alone for a while and let me get done. It's kind of like, you know, I'm busy right now, but I'll talk to you later about this, you know. And in a way, I would argue that he has become dramatically more presidential, but that there are components of his behavior that are never going to leave because they are who he is. They're not volitional. They're part of his self-description. But think about this notion, because it's very important for us as we move forward. I deliberately picked the terms for the table. Anti-stupidity is a key part of anti-political correctness, which is a key part of being anti-left. Because if you're left, you are politically correct and stupid. Because you can't possibly be intelligent about the real world and be politically correct and left, because they're insanity. They're suicidal. And so I want to set up a very clear model. Everybody in the room who wants to be left-wing ideologues, dedicated to politically correct distortions of reality, engaged in being intellectuals yet idiots, you have a role. You can be for Elizabeth Warren. But I don't want you to ask me to pretend that I think you make any sense, because you don't. And I think it's very important that we get to this level of just taking apart all of their presumptions and all of their pretenses. So I think it means you focus on facts and pragmatism, that facts lead to the philosophy, and that we also remember that there are a number of very specific things that come out of all that. One last big thing I want to talk about, which is to be found in The Art of the Deal. And literally, if you want to understand Trump, if you read The Art of the Deal and The Art of the Comeback, it carries you a long way in the right direction. So, New York City had a skating rink, which still, I actually want to go up and film sometime, in Central Park, called the Woolman Skating Rink. And it had a problem in 1980. It was no longer making ice. And skating rinks without ice are a little silly. And so the city of New York undertook a project to fix the skating rink. And 6 years later, and $13 million later, it's still not making ice. This gets you down to sort of pragmatism versus theory. The New York Parks Department had an elaborate explanation of why an iceless skating rink was not a failure, because they were trying hard, which gets you one of the core values of Trumpism, which is you measure output, not input. So Trump had had a townhouse where he could look down on the skating rink, had figured out, because of his highly sophisticated intellectual background, there's no ice. And I mean, I want you to understand this. I think this one story is at the heart of Trumpism. You start out with a practical thing. There is no ice. How long has there been no ice? 6 years. Why is there no ice? Well, the city's trying to fix it. The bureaucrats can't figure out how to make ice. How much have they spent? 13 million. So he gets into a war in print, and there's a section I want to read to you. This, I really do think this is one of the great central definers of Trumpism. So he says, and think about this in terms of yesterday's press conference. If there's one thing I've learned from dealing with politicians over the years, it's that the only thing guaranteed to force them into action is the press, or more specifically, fear of the press. You can apply all kinds of pressure, make all sorts of pleas and threats, contribute large sums of money to their campaigns, and generally, it gets you nothing. But raise the possibility of bad press, even in an obscure publication, and most politicians will jump. Bad press translates into potential lost votes, and if a politician loses enough votes, he won't get reelected. If that happens, he might have to go out and take a 9-to-5 job. That's the last thing most politicians want to do. So he goes after Koch and the press, and Koch finally gets so mad at him, he says, fine, we're going to turn over the women's skating rink. You're going to have 6 months and $3 million to fix it. Now, this gets to the second part that nobody in this city understands yet, and my greatest fear is that Trump will not be able to communicate this to his cabinet and to his staff and then to the House and Senate Republicans. So I want to read this again because this is the heart of, I think, of Trumpism. Okay. He says, I had just one challenge left, building the skating rink fast and building it right. If I failed, if I was even 1 day late or $1 over budget, my plan was to pack my bags and take the next plane to Argentina. There was no way Ed Koch or anyone else would ever let me live it down. This is the key. This is the sentence that convinced me that I really was fascinated with Donald J. Trump, and I really wanted to see what he would do. Since I myself knew absolutely nothing about building rings. Remember, he's been engaged in a public war with the mayor of New York over this thing and has no idea what he's going to do. I set out to find the best skating rink builder I could. Logic suggested that the best place to look was Canada. Ice skating is to Canadians what baseball is to Americans, the national pastime. The top builders, I figured, were probably the companies that built rinks for Canada's professional hockey teams. Sure enough, everyone I talked with agreed that a company called Simcoe, based in Toronto, was the best of the best. Among other projects, they'd built a rink for the Montreal Canadiens. I got their top guy on the phone and I began with a very basic question. What does it take to build a great outdoor skating rink? He gave me a very quick course in rink construction. And that's the beginning. Then he flies in, they look at the rink, they come back over and tell Trump, this is truly stupid. It's hard to believe the city could be this idiotic. 3 months, $2.25 million. So this is the challenge. I want you to think about this. Because one of my tests for whether or not we crossed a watershed is whether or not we eliminate the current CBO. If the congressional Republicans lack the courage to eliminate the current CBO, we have not yet crossed the watershed. And here's the reason. And you can get your congressman to test this out by just calling CBO. The women's skating rink, under city bureaucracy, spent $13 million 6 years and failed. Under entrepreneurial leadership, it spent $2.25 million in 3 months and succeeded. That is a 24-to-1 exchange rate in time and a 4-to-1 exchange rate in money. So when you get a CBO score for the Mexican Wall, if you actually had a President Trump who could cut through the bureaucracy and cut through the red tape, you have to cut that by some remarkable number. If you had the next military contract and it was done on Trumpian terms, if you had the next infrastructure plan and it was done on Trumpian terms, the Congressional Budget Office could not possibly score any of these things entrepreneurially. And therefore, they will totally screw up what Trump's trying to do. Furthermore, it is a corrupt institution which used the designer of Obamacare as its advisor in scoring Obamacare, and then created a score which was totally false. And if they had produced the score they came up with a year later, Obamacare would never have passed. Now, in my mind, there's a simple test in a watershed. Have you got the guts to be honest and kill it, or are you going to try to pretend you can fix a system that's not fixable? So I'm going to play Donald J. Trump to Ed Koch and say to the congressional Republicans in the House and Senate, if you let CBO survive, you're on the wrong side of the watershed. It's that simple. Period. End of story. Because you're not going to be able to do anything you want to do, because they won't score it intelligently. So let me carry this one or two steps further on this. The key, and by the way, I'm told by Giuliani that even better than the Woolman skating rink is the Ferry Point golf course, which in Bronx, which neither Giuliani nor Bloomberg could get built. They turned it over to Trump, and he finished it in 18 months. They now have an 18-hole golf course in the Bronx. And he said it's an even greater achievement, technically, more complicated than Woolman. So what do? You measure output, not input. You focus on effective government, not bureaucratic process. Philip Howard may be the leading thinker on this and talks about an idea which I'm hoping Heritage is going to take up in a big way, which is output-based regulations versus input-based regulations. Now, why does that matter? The Wright brothers spent $500 for 500 flights. They go down every summer, and they literally try 500 times, and it doesn't work. It cost about $1 a flight. They were very frugal. They were paying for it themselves. They were sleeping in a tent. They didn't have a government grant. At any point they'd had an input-based model, they'd have quit. They had an output-based model. Will it fly? On December 7th, 1903, December 17th, they got up in the morning, and the first 4 flights failed. The 5th flight, it flew a distance shorter than the wingspan of a Boeing 747 at a speed slow enough that one brother could run alongside to make sure it didn't flip over and kill his brother, and cartwheel and kill his brother. But it flew. And once they had figured that out, the rest became easier and easier and easier. No congressional system, no bureaucratic system could have done it. And in fact, the Smithsonian spent about $50,000 in the same time period and failed totally. But that's because they were totally output driven. Is it going to fly or not? And they didn't have to fill out long reports on failure. You could build, if you go to Governor Wilson and Governor Schwarzenegger, Governor Leavitt, Governor Mitch Daniels, and Governor Kasich, and ask them what each of them did in building highways outside federal regulations, you have the beginning of a Trumpian infrastructure plan that is probably 40 or 50% cheaper than the current system. Philip Howard estimates that if you simply went to a one-stop for all of the studies simultaneously, you probably save a third of the cost. So you start thinking differently. A Trumpian infrastructure with public-private partnership and a Woolman-Rink entrepreneurial drive should create $1 trillion in infrastructure for about $400 billion. And any model that's not doing that shouldn't pass the Congress. I mean, the Congress has to stop, think deeply, and by the way, the same thing applies to space. The same thing applies to the Pentagon, which I'm going to talk about in the next talk. Trump knows that the real key is to inspect, not expect. Even though he's hired Canadians, he says in the Woolman chapter, he went almost every day to the site because his personal prestige was at stake. Very different model. I mean, if somebody high up had been monitoring the F-35, we'd be in a totally different place. If they'd been monitoring the Boeing development of the new Air Force One, we'd be in a totally different place. If they've been monitoring disabilities, I mean, go down the list. You currently have a government which processes paper but doesn't inspect. Trump also understands you can get the best possible experts. And if you look at his cabinet and the way he's built his cabinet, I'll just give you the most recent example, which is Shulkin. I've been actively in favor, and I've done a lot of work on the VA. I've been actively in favor of keeping Dr. Shulkin, who's only been there for a year, who is a tremendous medical doctor. But it hadn't occurred to me to promote him to be administrator, because he's really a health specialist. Trump interviewed 25 people. The people who wanted the job, he didn't think could do it. The people he thought could do the job didn't want it. And so he finally got frustrated enough. He turned to Toby Cosgrove, the head of the Cleveland Clinic, and said, pull together 5 of the best hospital administrators in the country, form a panel, and give me a name. And they came back and said, the truth is Shulkin probably knows more about the system, has a greater reputation among medical people around the country, and we think you ought to promote him. So I said, fine. But it's the instinct of being able to turn and say, I want the best. I want to know exactly how to get this done right. That is at the heart, I think, of the whole Trump model. Finally, I think it's very important to understand that Trump, learned a great deal from living in New York under Giuliani. 2 books I always recommend to people are Giuliani's book on leadership and Bill Bratton's book on turnaround. What Giuliani did in turning New York around, with Trump living in the city watching how he did it, it's no accident to me that Trump has just recruited Rudy to work on cyber problems, and they have a great affection. But I think you have to look at the impact of somebody who is as aggressive, as driven as Rudy was, the impact he had breaking out of the old system, and how they literally transformed policing. And then in terms of being stupid and PC, you have to look at Chicago, where there have been almost 4,000 people shot in the last year. And you have to ask yourself, how could you live in a country where New York actually happened? It's not a theory. I mean, New York is today amazingly safe compared to the day before Giuliani became mayor. And why is it that none of the liberals can take that model to Chicago? And it begins to give you a sense of how different it is. And Trump knows the difference. He has seen it happen. He's seen personal leadership turn around our greatest city and do it despite all the odds at the time. So that's the framework. I'm going to talk next time about a Trumpian balanced budget, which I think will astound everybody, probably including the president-elect. But I think it is possible, having been the only Speaker of the House in your lifetime to help balance the budget for 4 straight years, I think it's possible we can get back to a balanced budget within the framework of Trump's approaches, and I'm going to talk about that next time. Can we take questions for a couple minutes, Ed?
Yeah, my name's Don Cook, and I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. Yeah, my name's Don Cook. I'm a retired Foreign Service officer from the State Department, and I was Executive Secretary of the Foreign Service Grievance Board, so I face this problem firsthand. Why is it so difficult to discipline a federal government employee who is engaged in wrongdoing, and so easy to retaliate against the person who reports it? And what can we do about it?
Well, it's a culture of self-protection going back to the 1883 Pendleton Act, and the notion that in order to protect the public from politicians, you have to create bureaucrats who can't be challenged. I think one of the greatest challenges for Trump will be, and for the Republicans in the House and Senate, will be to learn the lessons of Scott Walker, who did very profoundly change the rules in Wisconsin and fought basically a war for a year to do it. They had 100,000 people in the streets in Madison. He had the Capitol occupied for 6 months. He and his wife both had death threats. But I think in the absence of something like that, of that kind of intensity, you have a real problem. And I think they will find very rapidly, by March or April at the latest, that they cannot run the current government unless they're prepared to take it on. Okay? Yes, sir. She'll run over and give you.
Thank you. Carl Galvin, in this city, intelligence and national security have become sacred cows to a very high degree, and I'd ask if you could please comment on the perspective of Trump on letting intelligence tell him what to do. He's apparently resisting the notion he needs to be briefed 5 days a week by, daily intelligence briefing. And is he going to perhaps follow through on what Harry Truman wrote a month to the day after Kennedy's assassination? Harry Truman wrote an op-ed piece titled, "Limit CIA Role to Intelligence." He suggested that the CIA was actually giving us a bit of a bad reputation around the world by interfering in other people's internal affairs. And just a book reference that may be of interest to everyone here and even to President Trump. Douglas Valentine has just published "The CIA as Organized Crime: How Illegal Operations Corrupt America and the World." Please comment on the relationship with the intelligence community.
You just covered a fairly large waterfront that could be. All I'll say today is that I hope that President Trump will apply the same common sense and intelligence to the intelligence system that he does to everything else. There's actually no need for a daily brief. A daily brief is a bureaucratic system that if you go back and you look what Eisenhower learned, or you go back and look what Truman learned, they were totally different than the current bureaucratically driven model. You know, in Trump's comment that being told every morning that Aleppo is still under siege is not necessarily all that useful. I mean, once you've heard it 5 or 10 times, you sort of get the message. So you don't need 2 years of Aleppo still under siege. And I think the intelligence system in that sense is way too bureaucratized. I'm hoping that he will assign Dan Coats, who's a very smart guy, the job of rethinking the whole system. You don't need 17 intelligence agencies and a DNI with 700 or 900 full-time staff. The system is, and second, it has been stunningly corrupted. I mean, these latest reports, the notion that these reports, A, could have been leaked, and B, could exist, both of those notions are just insanity. I mean, if you actually look at what they were giving the president and the president-elect about the Russians, the 2-page thing that turned out to come from a retired MI6 guy who was being paid to write it by somebody who was opposed to Trump. And it had drifted up, involving apparently, and again, I haven't seen it because it's classified, but apparently involving the allegation that a particular person had gone to Prague when all they had to do was call him and learn he'd never been in the Czech Republic. And the notion that that could drift all the way up to becoming a national story should be a signal to the 2 intelligence committees that they need to hold very, very tough hearings, and they need to profoundly reform the system. And I hope that Dan Coats will work with them in getting that done. Yeah, yes, sir. Let's see. He's coming to you.
Yes, sir. My name is Kami Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator, and my question is about the New York's top story today that if M5's former employee was involved collecting a dossier against Donald Trump, and he was undercover in Russia before that when he was working for M5. Do you think, I mean, there might be some information that based on fact, but there were a lot of fabrication. So given that media is going to exaggerate what is factual information, do you think it would hurt Donald Trump, this story, or it would help him?
I think what's going to happen is most left-wingers are going to cling to the stories as an excuse for not confronting defeat, and everybody else in the country is going to think they're stupid. You know, I mean, explain to me what it is that the Russians are supposed to have done with or for Donald Trump that matters. I mean, if you said the Scots got to him because of Turnberry, at least I kind of get a connection. But he doesn't have any interest in Russia right now. You know, and I think that's very important. But beyond that, what does all this stuff mean? I mean, I don't see anything which validates the concerns we get told about. And when people talk about hacking, we have an agency in Maryland called the National Security Agency. It is the leading hacking institution on the planet. We've been doing it ever since 1939 or 1940. We treasure being able to do it. We won the Battle of Midway by eavesdropping, okay? And then we turn and say, oh my God, do you realize that the Russians, Israelis, the Chinese, all actively hack. The British actively hack, but they hack with us, so they're our partners. We call them the cousins. And so it's okay that they hack because they only hack with us, and therefore they're good guys. But what about the guys that, you saw that 2 years ago, here's poor Chancellor Merkel being told that we were eavesdropping. Now, first of all, I'm old enough that I don't mind eavesdropping on the Germans. The truth is, I want to know what the Germans are doing. But that's probably not a fair comment, and I guess I won't get back to Berlin in the near future. So, 1 or 2 more questions. One more. You're it, sir. No, this guy right here. Hold on.
Right there.
No, stay up. Don't be bold.
Hi, Jeff Brown, top of Google. I'm an entrepreneur, and I'm really excited to be up here to hear you speak. My wife is from Cuba, lived 28 years under the Castro regime, and we met on a mission trip. I was playing saxophone 3 years ago, and all legally we, got her to the United States. And so I'm thrilled about that. My question is about fiscal conservatism. Simpson Bowles didn't pass.
Wait. You can't have a lead in like that and then go. let me just say that my wife, who's sitting right in front of you as a French horn player, will be thrilled to know that playing instruments can lead to romantic encounters, and is delighted that it has worked.
We have a lot of comments.
Okay, now you get what will be clearly a much more boring and mundane question than your lead-in.
I was disappointed that the Simpson Bowles was not enacted and the Grand Deal. I didn't have much faith at all in Obama, but I was hoping for that. And I'm curious your opinion on fiscal conservatism in terms of a Simpson Bowles type act being enacted, and also the entitlement programs, which Trump has said he would not touch.
Okay, look, I'm very simple-minded. I am totally opposed to a grand deal which has a tax increase.
Okay.
Totally. This government has more than enough money. It does not need more money. It needs management. And second, I am totally opposed to scaring senior citizens. And we found out when we reformed Medicare in 1996 in a presidential year with AARP's support. And we did so in part because we spent a year training our members how to talk about it. Literally had a congressman from Florida who worked with every single member to get the language down right so that we wouldn't let the left define it. And people were comfortable with it. But one of the things we learned when we did focus groups is very interesting. No, the people who get scared are between 55 and 65 because they're not getting the check yet. People who are already seniors, say 70, 75 years old, they've lived too long. They go, all those politicians know we'll kill them. They're not going to do any of this because we'll just kill them. And the truth is, they would kill them. I lived through the one goofy thing Reagan agreed to, which was, I can't remember the name of it right now, but in 1987. Huh? Catastrophic, which was designed to very cleverly raise taxes on the upper middle income seniors and transfer the money to the poor seniors, and it actually helped about 3 poor seniors for every upper income senior that it hurt. However, there are 2 problems, which I experienced. I was a congressman, and I voted against it because it just felt totally crazy. The first problem was all these poor people who were eventually going to get helped didn't know it, didn't see it, and didn't care. The top 1/3 who were going to get hit, every one of them knew it. This goes back to micro versus macro, okay? And they're all sitting there going, let me get this straight. I have a cousin who didn't work very hard and spent all their money, and you're now going to take money from me to give to my cousin. I just want to understand this, so that when I kill you in the election this fall. And what really made it amazing was we've now built all these senior citizen centers where people go for lunch. So the very liberals who've built the senior citizen centers had all of these seniors showing up at lunch talking to each other and collectively going, don't you hate the government taking your money? And so you'd show up as a congressman and you'd have like 70 to 1. And the one was just confused because they didn't think they were going to get anything anyway because they didn't trust anybody. So I would just say to you that the problem with Simpson Bowles is it was invented by well-meaning people sitting in a room in Washington, all of whom had too much money to know the reality of micro behavior, and none of whom went out and talked to normal Americans. Other than that, it was a terrific effort. Thank you all very, very much. I'll see you
Next Tuesday.
Next Tuesday. I'll see you next Tuesday. We're going this way.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for being here. Thanks, everybody, for watching on the internet. We look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. We're adjourned.